Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I hope all of you are having a very nice day today. Continuing with my discussion of the works of John Carpenter, I would very much like to talk with you about this very special film. Beware of danger, beware of horror, beware of thrills, beware of The Fog. '80s, The Fog, directed by John Carpenter, and this is a scary, chilling ghost story that is another horror film from John Carpenter, the director of the very memorable horror film Halloween just a few years prior to this. In many ways, of course, there are certain similarities between this film and the previous works directed by John Carpenter, which I hope to get into in some detail in the latter half of this video. But in many other ways, I think this feels like a film that John Carpenter is doing maybe new things, some fresh things, and some things with the horror genre that we might not necessarily have seen from his works previous to this. So that in and of itself, I think, makes this film very interesting. But on top of that, my friends, on top of that, we have what I feel is a film that is filled with genuine scares and frights. And it is a film that I've seen many times, but regardless of the number of times I've seen it, and despite the fact that I pretty much know the progress and the course of the film and what's going to happen as I'm watching it, because I've seen the film a number of times, I still get caught in the many scares that are presented in this film. And believe me, it is a very scary film in that respect. So I find this film to be a delight and something of a peculiar work by John Carpenter, and I mean that in a very positive way. So with that, my friends, that is my general impression of this genuinely scary film, The Fog, directed by John Carpenter. The version that I have here for your information is the Shout Factory, Scream Factory Blu-ray, the collector's edition according to the box. This has the film itself, which is a high-definition transfer, and then it also has two commentary tracks, which is really great. So the first commentary track is by John Carpenter and Deborah Hill, and they are always providing a lot of detailed background information, and it is a very friendly conversation between the two of them, yet one that is packed with a lot of useful details about this film. A really great commentary track. Another commentary track that's included is with Adrienne Barbeau and Tom Atkins and also Tommy Lee Wallace. So they also talk about certain aspects of the film. They have a nice conversational rapport amongst each other, which is really lovely to hear. It's incredibly nice to hear these actors, in particular Adrienne Barbeau and Tommy Atkins, to hear them talk about certain aspects of the film, about John Carpenter, and about their working with him, and not only on this project, but on other projects as well. It's really lovely to hear. And of course, Tommy Lee Wallace has a great relationship with John Carpenter, as we know. So it's really lovely to see them talk or hear them talk about this particular film as they're watching it. It's really great. And then there are a few very interesting supplemental features First, there is a conversation, an interview / conversation with Jamie Lee Curtis. And she talks about her career as a sort of scream queen. And that's derived, I think, primarily from her work with John Carpenter on Halloween and also The Fog. So she talks about these films and also other films in her career, and it forms a really lovely conversation. I love Jamie Lee Curtis and her honesty and frankness, and she has a really well spoken way about her. She knows how to express herself very clearly and very precisely. And she does it also with a charming level of wit and good humor, and it's charming. It's also self-effacing and quite appealing in terms of listening to her many stories about working with certain directors, working on certain films and the like. So, and her take on the horror genre, even though the horror genre in many respects is probably where she found her so-called break in cinema. So, and she's very famous for her work with the she's very famous for her work with horror films and horror film directors. So it's a really lovely conversation. Then there is it's not listed on the back of this Blu-ray for whatever reason, my copy here, but then there is also a conversation interview with the director of photography, Dean Cundey. And this is very important because he goes into his methods and his general approaches to cinematography, which is really key to the works of John Carpenter, as we know, starting from his very almost pioneering work in many ways on the film Halloween, and then also on this film, The Fog. He also talks about his career and also his perspective on his professional life. So it's an incredibly illuminating interview conversation with Dean Cundey, and this is also very strongly recommended because he is one of the key figures in the John Carpenter filmography world. And then there is a featurette called Tales from the Mist Inside the Fog featurette, and then there is, which is sort of a it seems to be a featurette that was made contemporaneously with the film itself. But then there is another featurette called Fear on Film Inside the Fog featurette. This is indicated as being an MGM Productions, home video productions release, and so featurette, I mean. And so I would assume, I'm not so good with my release history of this film on home media, but I'm assuming that it's a documentary carried over from a previous release of this film, maybe on DVD. So, but it's very filled with information, and John Carpenter and Deborah Hill are interviewed, as well as many of the actors as well. So, and also the key members of the crew. So it's really great. It goes into some of the aspects that have also been discussed elsewhere on this disc, but one of the main components, for example, is the fact that after the film was it was completed at first, John Carpenter and Deborah Hill and the others realized that there were some elements of the film that maybe to them appeared to be lackluster, and so it was decided to carry out a considerable amount of reshoots in order to in their eyes, fix many aspects of the film that they thought needed fixing. And so a significant portion of the final film is actually the product of reshoots. And so we get to hear some of these details in this documentary, along with other great details about the actors that were employed, the settings, and how things came to be. So highly recommend stuff. Very, very great. And then we have another featurette called The Fog, Storyboard to Film featurette. And then there's a Horrors Hallowed Grounds documentary as well, which is very customary with the Scream Factory releases. It's really great. And then plus outtakes and theatrical trailers and TV spots and the like. So this is packed with a lot of really fascinating special features. So this is the Shout Factory, Scream Factory release from some years back. So this is The Fog, and so my friends, starting from now, I will be talking about specific details of this film, The Fog. So if you have not seen the film, I would strongly recommend that you stop this video and you watch the film, The Fog, if you are okay with watching scary movies. Of course, if you are not into scary movies as much, then perhaps this film might not necessarily be your cup of tea, which is fine. You shouldn't feel like you have to watch a film that you are otherwise uncomfortable with in any way. There's no reason to do that. So you don't have to watch it if you don't want to. But if you are interested in this kind of scary film genre and you have not seen John Carpenter's The Fog from 1980, then I would strongly suggest that you stop this video, try to find a copy of the film The Fog, and then once you've seen the film, you can come back to this video at any time, where I would love to hear your thoughts and comments and ideas and impressions with respect to John Carpenter's The Fog. Okay, so you're back. So I'm assuming that you have seen John Carpenter's The Fog. What did you think of this film? Did you like it? Did you not like it? Somewhere in between. I think for me, this film has been a film that I was scared witless when I first saw it as a young child. And this was because of the scariness of the imagery. You have these zombie-like figures, and their ominous-looking shapes and shadows, and their figures as they appear in terms of their silhouette. Their horrible, almost disfigured-looking silhouettes against these white, bright, foggy backgrounds that are just illuminated to the max. And when you've got the final confrontation with Blake and Father Malone, for instance, you've got the added touch of the eyes, and also when you've got the shots of some of the figures attacking Stevie Wayne atop the lighthouse there on the roof. You get a shot of one of them, and it's a really grotesque-looking face covered with worms. I understand from a comment made by Deborah Hill on one of the supplements that was actually a special effect that was created by Rob Bottin. So this is a very, these are really ghastly, gross-looking figures, and they're at the center of this really frightening ghost story that is filled also not only with this kind of creepy-looking imagery, but also with these really genuinely effective jump scares that are well crafted, well put together in terms of the music, the sudden shocks that appear, silence turning into suddenly jolts of sound. Things like from simple things like rocks falling from the wall, hitting a desk with a thud, like we said at the very, very beginning with Father Malone and how he discovers the diary. Simple things like that, to more stage things like the weather outlook man, Dan O'Bannon, which is a very interesting name. I'll get to that later in the video, played by Charles Cyphers, and the fog has attacked his particular outpost station, and he opens the door and he says, there's no one here. And then suddenly the arm reaches over, and then it attacks him, and then he is the next victim he is, I think, the fourth victim of the attackers. And so that is a very effective scare, filled with the atmospheric chills of the mist fog as it surrounds him, and the bright lights and the quiet, followed by a sudden rush, a sting of music provided by John Carpenter and crew. And these are just a couple of examples of these scares. So there is the imagery that adds to the scare factor. There are these jump scares that are incredibly well crafted, that add to the scare factor. And then there's also this the way in which the violence is staged. There are some very graphic scenes of things, people being stabbed and cut through, and these sorts of things. It's not overly graphic in terms of what we might otherwise see in, let's say, a horror film from today. But mind you, it is much more, let's say, explicitly violent in terms of the violence that's depicted on screen than, say, a film like Halloween, where we had violence that I think, while very effective, arguably speaking, was violence that wasn't necessarily shown directly on screen in terms of direct special effects. Well, here in The Fog we do get, while not overly done, we do get certain glimpses of special effects laden violence, where we actually see the violence taking place in certain ways. It's still done in a way that I think is somewhat restrained, and yet it is very shocking, because I think up to now, at least in John Carpenter's filmography, I don't think we've necessarily been used to seeing this kind of upfront violence portrayed on screen. Not that we haven't seen it at all before. As I say, there might be some moments in Halloween that could qualify. Also, we've seen some moments in, for instance, Assault on Precinct 13, with in terms of the attack on the precinct itself and things like that. But when we're talking about the, let's say, the level of violence and also the type of setups used in order to portray this violence, I think this is, up to now anyway, in John Carpenter's filmography, the most on-screen violence that we've seen in the context of this kind of genre film. And so I think that adds a level of shock. It also adds a level of genuine surprise. And also it creates further sense of unease and dread as we go along. Because it's surprising because not all of the, let me take this back. I would say that many of the violent scenes take place maybe early on in the film. And then later, as the film progresses to its sort of inexorable conclusion, as the terror scares tend to build up, I would say that, generally speaking, the violence level tends to be toned down a bit in favor of what we are feeling or what we are experiencing in our minds. In other words, the violence that we see early on, in particular the violence that's committed against the first two victims of Blake and his men as they emerge on the fishing trawler, the seagrass. And we see the thing with the sword and also this huge hook. It's quite graphic, but I think also we get the use of the sound effects as well that really heighten the intensity of those scenes. But as we get further into the film, I think the amount of violence becomes less and less, because we have been so primed in our minds to expect a certain level of danger from this menace that is Blake and his men, the undead, as it were, that are inside this quite ghostly fog. So I find that to be a very effective use of this notion of sort of on-screen violence as a means to heighten the horror, as it were, and therefore that adds an overall tension which is quite unbearable as the film progresses. And it's very effective. So I think those are the general approaches to screen violence, and also the way in which horror is treated in The Fog, which I think on the one hand might be seen as similar to what we've seen in John Carpenter's filmography past, but also in many ways as things that are different to what we have seen before. I should add also that I've mentioned that John Carpenter's filmography tends to be having a lot of linkages with the cinematic past. For example, John Ford, Howard Hawks, and Alfred Hitchcock and others, Sergio Leone and others. I would say that the use of on-screen violence that is portrayed in The Fog, as I've described it, I would say it is not necessarily dissimilar to, for example, the use of violence as we see it in, let's say, Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. I think there's a similar level of on-screen violence, but as the film progresses, maybe we see less on-screen violence and more of the expectation of violence that's engendered by this feeling of suspense and psychological dread that we have come to expect because we have been so shocked in the earlier part of the film. I think there is a similar principle at work here in The Fog, and so perhaps, I'm not sure if it's on purpose or not, but at least in terms of thematic or a stylistic approach to horror and scares, there is yet another link between John Carpenter and Alfred Hitchcock. So That's my general approach to the horror aspects of this film in general. Then I think we can speak to the strong characterizations that we see in this film, and that are, as always with any John Carpenter film, anchored very effectively by the actors who portray these characters. So we have, of course, Adrienne Barbeau, who is Stevie Wayne, I think one of the most memorable and in many ways one of the most iconic characters in John Carpenter's filmography. She has a certain I mean, how should I put it? She is very intelligent, and she has the intelligence to realize that something is wrong. She's one of the first people to realize that something is very wrong with this notion of the fog and what is going on and all the coincidental things that are happening with respect to the fog. And she is the one of the earlier characters who begins to piece things together as to what's going on. And so she is, on the one hand, I think she is very capable in that respect. And she also knows about how should I put it? She also has a sort of a sense about how she can use what is available to her to defend herself and to protect those around her. Right? She is a radio DJ, and so in a very key moment in the film, she is very quick to realize that the only way that she can alert people to help her son, who is alone in her house with sort of a nanny babysitter, Mrs. Kobritz. The only way that she can help her son is by using the radio in order to make an appeal to the general public to have someone go to her house and save her son, which I think is a very clever way of using what she has at her disposal, which is her radio equipment on the one hand, but is also very quick on her feet, and it's a very panic situation for her character because she's of course very concerned about her son, but at the same time she is cool enough to realize that that's probably the best way to help. So I find that and that's also a great narrative trick too, because then that allows the narrative to have the Stevie Wayne story and her son Andy, that storyline, to converge with the Elizabeth and the Nick storyline, the Tom Atkins and the Jamie Lee Curtis storyline, because they're the ones who drive to the house and save the son from the ghastliness of the fog. So I love that aspect of Stevie Wayne. I think she is really splendid, and I should say that the attack by the ghastly revenant zombies on her lighthouse there at the end, I think, is really quite effective when she's crawling on the roof there, and there are moments when she is injured. One of the zombies injures her, and she holds on for dear life, but she slips down the sort of rusty paneling there, the metal paneling there, and you get the shots of her fingernails, and they're grinding down. Ugh, that makes me very queasy to watch. That sequence also is very reminiscent, for instance, of the climactic scene along Mount Rushmore in the Alfred Hitchcock film North by Northwest, in terms of climbing along a surface at night with adversaries in pursuit after you, and just trying to hold on to dear life. And so I find that sequence, I get another way in which John Carpenter is being linked to Alfred Hitchcock in the cinematic past. And then we have Tom Atkins as Nick Castle, right, which is a great name, which is another link to a John Carpenter world. As we know, Nick Castle has a number of linkages with John Carpenter's films, most notably playing The Shape in Halloween. But Tom Atkins, I think, is a very down-to-earth presence. He is someone who has a certain rugged, real-world feel about him, and he has been sort of tested by the world, and maybe he's a little bit tired, but he's very approachable and very likable, I think. Tom Atkins is an actor. I should point out that he is such a likable person when he is being interviewed and when he's heard talking, for instance, on the commentary track of The Fog. I should point out too that there's an interesting aspect to Tom Atkins' character here about how he picks up Elizabeth Sully, that's another great character name. I'll get to that in a second. But he picks up Jamie Lee Curtis's character Elizabeth, hitchhiker, and then they're driving. And then the next time we see them, basically they're together in bed. So Tom Atkins is, how should I put it, somewhat of a ladies' man, shall we say. And he has a similar kind of character trait as the character that he plays in another film called Halloween 3, Season of the Witch. And he was asked about this in an interview that is included in the Scream Factory release of Halloween 3, Season of the Witch. And he was laughing about it, and he kind of was in on the sort of joke, if you will, in terms of how that's a somewhat amusing aspect, if you will, as part of the characterizations of the characters that he ended up playing in The Fog and also Halloween 3. And so he was very self-effacing, very modest, and he was laughing, and so he kind of is in on the joke, as it were. And so I think that makes him very likable, and it just makes, I think, him as an actor being very likable helps us to sympathize with the characters that he's playing. So here he's playing Nick Castle, who is one of the heroes of the film, which is really great. But what's really nice about this is that this film, I think, balances so well among its very wide and various cast members. So we also have Jamie Lee Curtis as Elizabeth Sully, and so if you know the film Someone's Watching Me, there's actually a character, he's a very minor character in that film, but there's a character that is actually named Elizabeth Sully in that film. And so the exact name is being used to name the character of Jamie Lee Curtis, who I would say is very different than her character, Laurie Strode, in Halloween. There's a difference in approach. There's a certain affability in both characters, I would say, but here it has a different way of expressing itself outwardly. And she is, I would say, somewhat more minor character here than the character that she played in Halloween, and yet still she has a great sensibility and way about her that I think also makes her very likable, and we understand her impulses, and we understand where she's coming from, more or less. And so she is tagged with the character played by Tom Atkins, the Nick Castle character, and I think they form a really nice they form a really nice couple, if you will, in terms of them being together and their storyline, which leads in many respects, in many places, until they go to the final confrontation at the church with Father Malone. Jamie Lee Curtis's mother, Janet Leigh, is also here. She plays a character called Kathy Williams, and she is paired with another John Carpenter actor actor who's in the John Carpenter group, and that's Nancy Loomis as Sandy. And so they're paired together, and so I like the appearance of Janet Leigh here. Of course, there is another very direct tie with John Carpenter film and Alfred Hitchcock, and also cinematic past, and how that past is represented with the presence of Janet Leigh. I think it's really great. I love Janet Leigh's performance here. She is a bit like she could have been that kind of character that was sort of a community leader type, a mayor type figure, if you will, who didn't listen to reason, and because she didn't listen to reason, everything sort of became a real calamity, if you will, or catastrophe. But no, I was very surprised. On the one hand, she was very concerned about the festivities of the evening, the celebration of the 100 years of Antonio Bay, and what that signifies to the community on the one hand, but also on the other hand, she as a character showed a lot of sensitivity, because her husband was one of the men who was on the fishing boat, the Seagrass, that disappeared. I mean, we as viewers know what happened to the three men on there, so We see a moment where she is visibly breaking down, and she's quite upset at the disappearance of her husband. And so that provides a nice means by which her character can become quite sympathetic. And she is matched in her scenes with Nancy Loomis' character, and I really love her performance here. She has an kind of, again, down-to-earth, all the characters I think are down to earth, but I love Nancy Loomis here because she has a real down to earth quality of she's working and she is a little bit fed up, but she's kind of maybe sassy or a little bit clever, maybe too clever by half, so to speak, but she is never unlikable, and she provides yet another distinct tone or flavor to the film, by which I think we can get many distinct characters, and each has his or her own presence, if you will. And so I like the way that she comes in and provides a little bit of counterbalance to the Kathy Williams, the Janet Leigh character. It's really nice. Again, it's a supporting role, but it's still a great one. And so she is, of course, among the people who get trapped in the church there at the end, which is very significant. And then we have a real, almost dark horse type of character in the form of Father Malone, who is quite a creepy character in terms of his brooding, dark nature. And he seems to be so, I think, in primary part because of some kind of guilt by familial association that he seems to feel, because of the truth that he uncovers with respect to what happened all those years ago with respect to Blake and his crew and the Elizabeth Dane, and so and the responsibility of what happened and the weight of that on Father Malone's shoulders. And so I think that provides the impetus for his characterization being quite almost morbid seeming, somewhat portentous, quite ominous in terms of what he is, what he realizes as being the grave consequences of the founding of this community. So I really like that. That adds yet another tone to this. And Hal Holbrook, of course, has his own sort of cinema legacy prior to his appearance here. And so he provides yet another linkage to the cinematic past. And he also provides yet another way in which this film becomes weighted down with a sense of sort of a horror-themed gravitas, if you will, because I think in large part thanks to his presence, this film gains this level of, let's say, seriousness to the extent that we can suspend our disbelief and really go along with this almost outlandish ghost story. But it's outlandish to the extent that it's a John Carpenter horror film, and he allows it to reach the edges as wide as possible, but it's always grounded, and it's grounded in the sense of the horror approach that I was trying to explain earlier in this video, but it's also grounded in the characters, of course, included in which is the great Hal Holbrook as Father Malone, one of the most iconic characters, if you will. I love, there's a great moment, there are many great moments, but I love how there's the gold cross at the very end of the film, the climax of the film, that forms a real key component of Blake and his men. And I love how when Father Malone, Hal Holbrook, carries the cross to the main room, the pulpit, I think, he carries it in a way that it's so heavy. It's like such a great burden on his shoulders, if you will, or on his soul, and it's a great symbol of that. And the way he just carries it, he seems almost like a frail old man just carrying this huge thing, but it's the only thing that can protect him and the rest of the people there from this menace that is the fog and the people, or the revenants inside the fog. And so I just love that little touch that he gives to his performance. It's great. Also, there's a great jump scare when the Janet Leigh character visits the church earlier in the day. He's looking for Father Malone, and she can't find her, and then suddenly he emerges from the darkness. One of the great jump scares of the film, and it's really a quite simple thing, and I realized it based on comments by John Carpenter, Deborah Hill, and the commentary. I realized that was some of that was altered. The darkness was seemingly altered in post-production in order to make the darkness even darker, to not alert the viewers to the fact that Holbrook was there in the dark before he jumped out and touched Janet Leigh on the shoulder. I love Janet Leigh's reaction to that. The word she uses is really great, and she says, "I'm sorry." I love that moment. So with that, my friends, then what I'd like to talk about is this film itself, and I in terms of its narrative and what it tries to achieve as a kind of ghost story. I've tried to talk in a little bit in the beginning about how I think John Carpenter is approaching the horror aspects of this film, or how he is trying to approach the aspects of horror in this film. Let me put it that way. But when I think about this film itself, I think, on the one hand, I think that its narrative and the specifics of the narrative and the story about what happened to Blake and his crew and what happened to the ship, and the notion that there must be 6 victims to these zombies in the fog, the fact that the fog came around the time that they were killed 100 years ago, this idea of between 12 midnight and 1, the witching hour, as Stevie Wayne puts it, and these sort of eerie supernatural occurrences that happen in terms of shaking and rattling and car alarms going off and glass breaking at certain moments and the like, and glass shattering and things like that. And then that's added on by, of course, the appearance of the fog and the way in which these zombies appear within the confines of that unnaturally moving almost fog, which is in and of itself a living monster. It feels like a living, breathing thing that has its own consciousness, as it swirls around the air, as it were, which is a great sort of special effect that's used here. So these, I think, elements come together and also think like gold coins turn into wood. When Andy finds a little gold coin along the crashing waves there, and suddenly before our very eyes it becomes this piece of wood. Which then changes later. It says Dane, I think, but then it changes later when Stevie Wayne takes it to her lighthouse, and then she says, it changes wording, and it starts to erupt with this sort of supernatural liquid water, which then touches a tape recorder, which then allows Stevie Wayne to hear ghostly voices and all this. So and not to mention also the fact that when Dr. Phibes is examining one of the dead bodies from the fishing boat, and then Jamie Lee Curtis is alone with the dead body, we see the dead body start to come up almost like a zombie and grab, I think, some kind of scalpel or some kind of medical thing, which could be a very dangerous weapon, and then is seen slowly attack or slowly approach the Jamie Lee Curtis character, who has her back to the thing. And so there are these elements here that, on the one hand, seem to try to connect together to create a myth, if you will, about Blake and the kind of the physics of this horror. There were 6 people who killed them all off, and so the zombies are coming back for revenge and wanting to get their revenge on 6 people. So they want to kill 6 people, and all of a sudden car alarms go off, and all of a sudden there's this thing about 12 to 1, which is apparently due to a certain detail that happened in the past with respect to these men and their deaths. And also the fog came because the fog was there was some kind of fog that came around the time that they were dispatched with. And also there are these things about glass breaking and all this stuff. It seems to hang together on the one hand, and yet they're all almost like hanging disparate elements that are not necessarily explained thoroughly within the context of the film itself. In other words, there isn't any one scene in the film where a character sits down and then realizes all the disparate pieces are all connected in this way. Perhaps Father Malone is the closest we come to that kind of figure. He seems to be the one of these people who seems to know the most about what's going on. But even him, I'm not sure if he realizes all these little elements that are going on. Why things were happening between 12 and midnight, 12 midnight and 1, and why other things were happening throughout the town, and the like. And on the one hand, I think the fact that there isn't that kind of explanation scene might be seen to be a detriment to this film, because without that kind of scene, perhaps those horror elements, when you really start to think about it, they might seem a bit random, because there doesn't otherwise seem to be a kind of cohesive connective tissue that connects all of these seemingly random events of horror on the one hand. But on the other hand, I think this is a type of film where that kind of explanation doesn't really matter. What matters more are the visceral thrills that come from these elements that, while not necessarily shown to have any strong connective tissue, at the outset anyway, there is enough for us, the viewers, to sort of put everything together. But I don't think we necessarily need to put things together. There is just enough there for us to be able to suspend our disbelief, and for us to have an impression, if you will, of some kind of deep backstory with respect to the mythology that led to the events of the film, rather than really get into the nitty-gritty of what exactly happened, why this happened in the past, which correlates to why this occurs in the present. This happens in the past, which correlates to why this. We don't need necessarily that kind of strong A to B kind of background explanation, if you will. I think there is enough there to help us along the way. Now, mind you, of course, there are some things that I think seem a little bit they seem to be a little bit, I don't know if random is the right word, but they do seem to be things that came up early but maybe weren't necessarily explained later on in the film. Like the 12 to 1 thing, the 12 midnight to 1 thing, it doesn't necessarily seem to have been something that was carried over as the film progressed to its second half, if you will. There's also the stuff about the gold turning into the wood. We don't quite know why that is, although Tom Atkins does give a story about what happened to him when he was younger, so that might have a connection, although we're not quite sure. And we don't know why the water erupted from that piece of wood, and what happened there. What was the reasoning behind that? I'm not quite sure why that is. And also, we don't know the nature of the fog. Why did the fog come in the first place? What makes this fog different from another fog? I mean, what is it about this? We're not quite sure why that is. And so there are these questions that, when one thinks about it after the fact, they might not necessarily stand up to a strong level of scrutiny. Okay, but at the same time, there is no need necessarily to subject him to that high level of scrutiny, because we are dealing with a film that is filled with elements of horror, and I think that's enough to engage us in our interests. And when we're dealing with elements of horror, one of the aspects, generally speaking, of elements of horror is this idea of the unknown, right? There is more scariness and there's more horror associated with these elements when their origins are unknown to us. And so I think the fact that there is this vague connection, or there's a lack of explanation with respect to the background and why things happen the way they are, I think while these events might not necessarily hold up to any kind of logical scrutiny, on the other hand, this is a horror film, and so the less known about these things, perhaps the more effective they become. And that's my approach to these otherwise random events that we see with this film, The Fog. And with that mindset, my friends, I find this film to be quite an effective one, and one that really scares me, really scares me even now. And I was watching this recently, partly in preparation for this video, and I was still amazed at how scared I was. I still jumped when the scares came. I knew when they were coming, and still I jumped. So I find that to be quite remarkable. And I don't know how many times I must have seen this film. I'm not sure, just countless amount of times when I was younger, and up to now, of course. So, but let's see. I think that is my general take on this film, The Fog. I think it is a remarkable achievement in horror. It is also a film from 1980, so this is also very significant for John Carpenter in that we will this is opening up yet another period of his career, arguably speaking, and this does have linkages with the John Carpenter films that we saw prior to this, but I think in many ways it is opening the door to a new phase of John Carpenter's career that we will see blossom and develop and really take shape in many profoundly interesting ways throughout the 1980s. So it'll be very interesting to see how John Carpenter's filmography progresses from here. It's a great place to stop, of course, in terms of a filmography. You've got this great idea of The Fog and the horror elements that are at play here. So, my friends, this is John Carpenter's The Fog. Thank you very much for your time, as always. It's always great to see you, and I hope you are well. If you have any thoughts or comments about this film, The Fog, please feel free to leave them down below in the comment section. I would very much, very, very much love to hear what it is you have to say about this remarkable horror film achievement. Okay, my friends, that's it for now. So until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well. And please, please, please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. So until we meet again, my friends, cheers.